Well, the cost of the futile attempt to reach the Paris targets will be astronomical. We're already feeling the pressure on energy prices, and the flow-on effect to the rest of our economy will be diabolical. And yet we keep being told that renewable energy is cheaper and nuclear is too expensive. Unpacking the true cost of power isn't a straightforward exercise. It's easy to make a clown of yourself, as Rod Campbell from the Australia Institute did recently when he appeared before a parliamentary committee.
Labor and the market operators plan for a net zero electricity grid, as reflected in the market operators integrated system plan. What is the total system cost of getting to net zero based on that renewables only plan?
I don't know. I haven't researched that.
That's how you can make an idiot of yourself if you don't do your homework. But Gerard Holland from the Page Research Centre does do his homework, and he made an excellent attempt to explain the cost of renewable energy at a recent art conference in Sydney.
Let's make a bit of a back-of-the-envelope calculation of how much the differing pathways would really cost. Now, when designing a grid, first you have to look at the piece of equipment that's actually generating the electricity. So in the case of renewables, this is your solar panels and wind turbines, and in the case of coal, these are our coal-fired power stations, and in the case of nuclear, our nuclear reactors. But there's more to the story. Generation is bound by a capacity factor. So in essence, you have the total potential that can be produced, and then you have the actual amount that that piece of equipment is running for. So, for on average, a nuclear power runs at a capacity factor of about 90%. Coal's a little bit lower at 70 to 80, and this has been factored into these costings. But renewables are much lower. They're around 32% for wind and 23% for solar. So to actually produce the same amount of electricity as coal or nuclear, you need to overbuild, which now looks like this. Now, the typical lifespan of a nuclear power plant is 60 to 80 years. The typical lifespan of a coal-fired power station is 40. But the typical lifespan of a solar panel or a wind turbine is 20 to 30 years. So let's take our lower bound for nuclear and say over a 60-year period, we have to replace renewables twice. Now let's add in our workers' wages and our operations costs. Now the advantage of wind and solar is that it doesn't require a fuel source, which nuclear and coal do. So over the life cycle, you can expect coal and nuclear costs to look like this. Now, notoriously, you have to process and store the spent fuel from nuclear plants. Let's add those costs in. But the advantage of using a fuel source is that you can have 24-hour power. Unfortunately, renewables don't produce electricity when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, so you need storage. Enough storage to power an entire evening. So let's add this storage in, and this is a mixture of pumped hydro and batteries. And of course, batteries need replacing too, and being generous, these can last up to about 20 years. So.
Tonight, the great climate reset. Donald Trump's re-election sends shockwaves through the global climate change community. We talked to Henry Olsen, Gerard Holland, David Gillespie, Saxon Davidson and James Matthias about the big shake-up in the climate and energy world. That's all coming up on Reality Bites, which streams every Friday night on this channel at 8 p.m, or you can watch it anytime at demand by going to realitybites.tv. Donald Trump captured the hearts of many Americans by being prepared to say what other people thought, but weren't prepared to utter. Now his return to the political stage is shaking up the global debate, particularly on energy and climate policy. Trump's promise to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement, cut electric vehicle mandates, slash green subsidies and stop support for so-called climate refugees has sent the world's business and media elite into a state of nervous panic. Trump's election already made waves in the energy markets, where oil prices dropped in anticipation of his drill baby drill policy. His influence stretches far beyond the American borders. Just look at the current climate conference in Azerbaijan. Even before the world's bureaucrats, lobbyists and politicians had taken their seats, Argentina's climate skeptic President Javier Milei pulled his delegation out, emboldened by Trump's stance. Who could be next? to step away from the Paris Agreement, its lofty but faltering goals. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban echoed a sentiment growing across Europe when he defended his commitment to oil, gas and nuclear energy. Quote, "We cannot sacrifice our industry or agriculture," close quote, Orban said. We cannot impose unrealistic quotas or burdensome rules on farmers and companies. The reality is that 8 years after the Paris Agreement was signed, the world's major emitters, China, the US, India and Russia, are not on track to meet its goals. Collectively, they account for about 60% of global CO2 emissions. Without them fully on board, the Paris process is effectively dead. And let's be clear, if the world's biggest emitters aren't meeting their targets, what hope is there for everyone else? Ironically, China, the world's biggest emitter by a long way, is well on the way to becoming a clean energy superpower. It's cornered the world market for solar panels, lithium batteries and electric vehicles. Yet the heavy manufacturing of those clean energy trophies has increased, not reduced, China's domestic demand for coal. Its insatiable fossil fuel appetite reveals the stark gap between climate change promises and reality. This climate change drama has a sequel in Europe. The Ukraine crisis reminded Europeans that reliance on renewables without a solid backup plan can leave you scrambling for fossil fuels and emptying wallets to pay off your electricity bills. And the power-hungry demands of AI technology make it clear that relying solely on wind and solar simply won't cut it. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a world that is increasingly seeing the writing on the wall. Leaders are looking for an off-ramp from the high-speed road to unrealistic climate goals. Trump's return could be the excuse they need, allowing them to pin the blame on America or the bogeymen in Russia for not hitting their ambitious targets. The cold truth is that the Paris Agreement, despite its noble intentions, has become more of a distraction than a solution. Energy markets are more volatile and renewables alone aren't meeting baseload demands. And who suffers most? The world's poorest, the ones who are least responsible for historical emissions. They're the ones paying the price for a system skewed by ideology over practicality. It's time for a reset. We need a balanced strategy, one that doesn't trade energy reliability or economic prosperity for feel-good policies that don't deliver. Aiming for progress that's practical and real is what will ensure prosperity for future generations. Otherwise, the 2050 net zero dream could turn into a cautionary tale, one of ambition blinded by an unwillingness to confront reality. Well, the cost of the futile attempt to reach the Paris targets will be astronomical. We're already feeling the pressure on energy prices, and the flow-on effect to the rest of our economy will be diabolical. And yet we keep being told that renewable energy is cheaper and nuclear is too expensive. Unpacking the true cost of power isn't a straightforward exercise. It's easy to make a clown of yourself, as Rod Campbell from the Australia Institute did recently when he appeared before a parliamentary committee.
Labor and the market operators plan for a net zero electricity grid, as reflected in the market operator's integrated system plan. What is the total system cost of getting to net zero based on that renewables only plan?
I don't know. I haven't researched that.
That's how you can make an idiot of yourself if you don't do your homework. But Gerard Holland from the Page Research Centre does do his homework, and he made an excellent attempt to explain the cost of renewable energy at a recent art conference in Sydney.
Let's make a bit of a back-of-the-envelope calculation of how much the differing pathways would really cost. Now, I'm making 3 assumptions before I present this. So, 1, all of our technologies will need to be replaced in the next 20 years or so, and so this chart assumes that in time the whole grid will need to be updated, so no preference is given to existing generation. 2, the expected demand on the grid is estimated to be about 304 terawatt hours by 2035, so as a minimum, that's the benchmark we're building to. And 3, the costs I've used are based on a fixed point in time, and we haven't considered discounting as there are just far too many variables there for our purposes. Are you still with me? Okay, great. Okay, now when designing a grid, first you have to look at the piece of equipment that's actually generating the electricity. So in the case of renewables, this is your solar panels and wind turbines, and for our purposes, we've gone for a 50-50 split of both. But regardless of which way you cut it, the costs come out roughly the same. In the case of coal, these are our coal-fired power stations, and in the case of nuclear, our nuclear reactors. So here's the scores on the board so far, 304 terawatt hours. But there's more to the story. Generation is bound by a capacity factor. So in essence, you have the total potential that can be produced, and then you have the actual amount that that piece of equipment is running for. So, for on average, a nuclear power runs at a capacity factor of about 90%. Coal's a little bit lower at 70 to 80, and this has been factored into these costings. But renewables are much lower. They are around 32% for wind and 23% for solar. So to actually produce the same amount of electricity as coal or nuclear, you need to overbuild, which now looks like this. Now, the typical lifespan of a nuclear power plant is 60 to 80 years. The typical lifespan of a coal-fired power station is 40. But the typical lifespan of a solar panel or a wind turbine is 20 to 30 years. So let's take our lower bound for nuclear and say over a 60-year period, we have to replace renewables twice. Now let's add in our workers' wages and our operations costs. Now the advantage of wind and solar is that it doesn't require a fuel source, which nuclear and coal do. So over the life cycle, you can expect coal and nuclear costs to look like this. Now, notoriously, you have to process and store the spent fuel from nuclear plants. Let's add those costs in. But the advantage of using a fuel source is that you can have 24-hour power. Unfortunately, renewables don't produce electricity when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, so you need storage. Enough storage to power an entire evening. So let's add this storage in, and this is a mixture of pumped hydro and batteries. And of course, batteries need replacing too, and being generous, these can last up to about 20 years, so they'll need to be replaced 2 more times. So we've just added those replacements in. But batteries don't produce electricity, they only store it. And this is only enough storage to keep the grid going for one night. So what happens if, say, we're in the middle of winter, and we have low sunlight and a wind drought, and we don't produce enough excess energy to charge our batteries for the following evening? And what happens when, like it did in June 2020, this wind drought lasts for 2 weeks. One option is to keep all of our existing gas turbines in operation. And that would mean a continued dependence upon fossil fuels, and we'd still have to pay for their replacements, operations, maintenance and fuel. And in keeping with our net zero commitments, we'd have to offset those carbon emissions with carbon capture storage. But if you want to do it with renewables, then we need at the very least to triple our solar to cover for the lack of wind energy being produced and to produce enough excess to keep our batteries charged. So let's add in another scenario. So we've got on the left a fully renewable grid, and then just next to that we've got one that keeps gas as a backup. We then have to consider how do we actually get the energy we've generated to the end user. So in the case of coal and nuclear, we can just use our existing sites and transmission in the grid. With renewables, on the other hand, you have to decentralise the grid. And you need transmission not only to the end user, but also hooked up to your storage. And then last but not least, we're going to consider our decommissioning costs. So let's add those in. And there you have it. This is what the differing pathways would cost to meet Australia's energy needs over the course of a generation. We right now, these 2 sticks on the left, we are right now on a path to 80% of this in the next 5 years.
Well, Gerard Holland joins me in the studio now. Gerard, welcome to Reality Bites. That was a really clear presentation, I thought, but admittedly, and I think we have to acknowledge this, at a high level, right? You're not actually coming up with extra numbers, firm, hard numbers. You're just showing how the cost mounts in the system costs with renewables as opposed to nuclear. That'd be fair, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We're not factoring in discounting when we're making these calculations, and of course we haven't factored in what already exists in the grid. But in order to create a sort of directional analysis to understand what are the different layers that you need to factor in your energy bill is not just the wholesale price. It factors in all of the system costs. It factors in the network costs. It factors in transmission. It factors in distribution. And then, of course, when you're looking over a generation, because some of our assets like coal-fired power plants and nuclear reactors can last for many decades into the future, you have to start thinking about how often do these assets need to be replaced. And if we are going to move towards a battery-led grid or a renewable-led grid, we have to think, well, it's not just building them the first time, it's continuing to maintain and upkeep that grid that we have decentralised and built out in a very different way.
And it seems to me it's impossible really to say how much renewables are going to cost us because we still haven't refined the technology, have we? I mean, I was in Broken Hill last week. I reported from Broken Hill on the 2-week power outage that they had because they were expecting batteries to kick in and solar panels to kick in and wind turbines to kick in when the main transmission line went down. But none of that happened, nil, zero. And they had to ship in diesel generators, which comes at an enormous cost. So you can see that it's no way of predicting, as far as I can see, how much renewables will finally cost, because we really don't know how to make the system work properly and stably, do we? If we can indeed do it at all.
Well, I think the really two important points that you've just highlighted, Nick, is the first one is there is no grid on a small scale or a large scale anywhere in the world that is 100% renewable and backed up by battery storage. We have grids where they have a heavy dependence and reliability on renewables. They're obviously very expensive, but there's always that fail-safe mechanism of getting in gas, getting in hydro, or whatever your backup might be in the system. So this isn't proven, this is brand new, and we don't really know if it's even physically possible. An incredible paper by Simon Michaud has just come out mapping out that even the lithium that would be required for 6 hours of battery storage around the world would require 25 times the amount of lithium that's ever been mined in human history. It's about 6 times the amount of cobalt, and the metals go on and on.
Well, the world's climate mafia and various hangers-on are gathered in Baku in Azerbaijan, a country, incidentally, that makes, I think, 90% of its exports from fossil fuel, from oil and gas largely. They're there for the latest COP conference. I've lost track of the numbers, and to look at how they're going on the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement is amazingly 8 years old. It's way off track, as far as I can see, Gerard, and people are looking for an off-ramp to get away from these ambitious targets, which they're unable to meet, technically or in any other respect. Do you think that Trump's presidency, therefore, comes at a fortuitous time?
Yeah, I think so. I think when you factor in that China, Indonesia, India have all rejected decommissioning or slowing down on their coal-fired power build. China still builds 2 a week. When you include Russia and Brazil, who've never had any serious or meaningful commitments to net zero, you're looking at over 50% of the world's emitters who aren't committed to Paris or achieving net zero. And of course, Trump now has made it very clear that he intends to pull out of Paris. He has the House, he has the Congress. You're now looking at around 60% of the world are just not on this journey. And net zero globally is dead. We've been told over and over again it's a global problem. Australia is a very, very small emitter when it comes to what other nations in the world are putting into the atmosphere. And when you factor in all of our trees and our forests and our farms, we're actually a net carbon sink. We pull out more carbon out of the atmosphere than we actually put in. So it's really up to Australia now to make the decision. Do we want to go this alone and don't put it past Australia to partner with other nations like New Zealand and England and Germany, who are equally suffering from high energy prices and energy insecurity? Do we go it alone with them, or do we return to more pragmatic and sensible policy making and invest in our own manufacturing capacity, our own energy security and reliability in our own community, and make sure that we're putting ourselves in the strongest possible position for whatever the next couple of decades might throw at us?
Yeah, I think we've got to be cautious because we don't know how much Trump's going to be able to achieve or how much he might get distracted by other issues. But it seems to me that he's focused on cutting back welfare for the renewable energy sector, cutting back a lot of the money that's been pumped in through the so-called Inflation Reduction Act is a good thing, because if you skew the investment of capital in a certain way, you get outcomes that aren't necessarily the most effective.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If you're a private investor and you're thinking about, say, building a new coal-fired power plant or going nuclear or whatever kind of energy installation, even wind or solar, and you've got a government actor who is actively pumping and subsidising a certain technology in your grid, will that then de-incentivise you to get involved because you think, well, are they going to change the regulatory framework at a moment's notice to pull the rug out from underneath me? Can I even make a profit, or will these subsidies kind of drive my profitability down? And so really removing the state from some of these decisions and actually letting these technologies compete on an even playing field. And the other really important point is renewables only produce energy for 6 to 8 hours a day. Our energy spot price is up for bidding every couple of minutes. And so that severely disadvantages steady, reliable 24-hour sources of power, such as coal, such as nuclear, because in those periods of high volume of solar or wind, the price gets driven right down. But then you have during the evening, when you're looking for your peaking power and your gas, that then pushes prices up, which hurts consumers. And maybe a longer load time for when these different bidders can actually put their technology onto the market to bid for. That would even out the system and make a much more even playing field as well.
Yeah, those are all examples of what I call non-market failure. It's what happens when governments start meddling too much in markets. The thing just falls to pieces. Look, move on to nuclear, because I know you've been looking at this closely at the Page Research Centre, and you're optimistic that the cost of nuclear will be very competitive. How so?
Yeah, absolutely. We've actually just recently made a submission into the current inquiry on nuclear power generation in Australia, particularly looking at the South Korean company KEPCO, and particularly looking at their Baraka plant in the UAE. And we found figures up to 2.6 times cheaper than GenCost and the CSIRO have proposed. And this isn't without factoring in that the Baraka plant has over 20,000 modifications to deal with the high water salinity, the lack of water, the huge temperatures that wouldn't be required on the kind of sites that Peter Dutton has identified here. So I am very convinced that we could do it much cheaper here. There is, of course, lessons from KEPCO, because KEPCO is an outlier. Their nuclear energy is the cheapest in the world in South Korea, and it's because they do things differently to what other jurisdictions have done. They have a quite vertically integrated structure. They encourage state investment into the infrastructure itself to make sure that it has that oversight. They also recommend that you have whoever's building the plant to have a stake in the generation at the back end, so that they're incentivised to build them on time, to spec and to price. And they also recommend that you go big on one site. So rather than setting out a diffuse grid and building one here and building one here, you do your first concrete pour, you pull the trucks around and you do your next concrete pour on the same site, and you build 5, 6, 7 gigawatts on one site. That's how they've kept their prices low. And if Australia took a similar approach, maybe even partnering with a group such as KEPCO, I'm surely convinced that we will have much cheaper electricity than our current transition pathway.
Yeah, and the point you made in your presentation very well is it's a legacy investment. If we start planning for a nuclear power station today, it will be powering electricity for my granddaughter's grandchildren. Now that just is amazing, isn't it? With that kind of thinking we need to bring back, isn't it, into this country?
Well, the low end that you'll get is 60 years out of a nuclear reactor. They go up to 80. KEPCO have suggested they can extend the life up to 100 years. And this is something, again, that GenCost just hasn't considered. They looked at a 30-year window, and they also assumed that the nuclear reactor would be operating at about 50% capacity, which would be double, triple what we get and expect out of renewables, but is very, very low compared to what nuclear reactors are able to produce overseas. This is an investment in Australia's future. It's an investment in our energy security, and it is a long-term investment. There's a lot of capital costs up front, but the long-term benefit of this will mean that Australians, for generations to come, have cheaper prices, secure prices, reliable electricity, and much fewer carbon emissions and environmental land impact on the environment.
Gerard, just quickly to close, we are coming up to an election. It may come sooner than we think. You're affiliated to the National Party as the director of the Page Research Centre, so you must be close to what's going on. What's your hunch? Is there a chance that Peter Dutton can win this election? And if he does so, will he be able to get through changes to get rid of basically the moratorium on nuclear?
So I'm a lot more optimistic now than I probably was a couple of months ago. I think Dutton and David Littleproud and the rest of the team are doing a great job getting their messages across. Of course, it's also a case of give Albanese enough rope, and this government has just been disaster after disaster. I think it's really in Albanese's hands now when he wants to take us to an election, what his strategy is. This misinformation bill that's coming through at the moment, I think, is deeply chilling and concerning. And the same thing with the nuclear debate, is the more informed the general public gets, I think the better the coalition's proposals look like, because they make sense, they're rational and they're reasonable. People have seen their power prices go up. They've seen, we've just been discussing blackouts in Broken Hill. They're seeing now online content is looking to be censored. This is not an election-winning strategy for Labor, and time will tell, but I'm in a much better place than I probably was at the start of the year.
I hope your optimism is well placed. Thank you for joining us again on Reality Bites, Gerard.
Thanks for having me, Nick.